Okay. So we're getting started. And so oh, there we go. Okay. I see some attendees coming in. Welcome, welcome. Julie Burrows. You know, the name rings a bell. The name rings a bell. Okay. We have folks coming in. We're going to get kicked off in just a moment or so. We'll give everybody a little bit more time to join us. Morgan and Kuldeep, how are you both today?
I am doing fantastic. How are you doing, Kelly?
I'm pretty good. How about you, Kuldeep?
I'm doing fantastic. Can't
Love
wait.
it.
I mean, it's like the middle of the week, 2 more days to go.
This is it.
Yeah.
And you're back. Are you back in Denver with us now?
Yes, I am in Denver. I missed all of the snow last week.
You did. You still see some kicking around though in the shady spots?
Yeah. No, I was worried about my trees and, because it had snowed. I mean, there were branches that were kind of questionable, but I missed all of that fun.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, I see folks are coming in. Welcome, welcome everybody. And we are recording today's session. So I think we're just about ready to get things kicked off. I would like to officially welcome everybody to our event today. We are going to be talking about data and AI governance frameworks. My name is Kalia Garrido, and I head up marketing and events here at Great Data Minds, which is a Hike 2 company. If you haven't already heard of us, Great Data Minds is a collective of passionate data activists, and we are on a mission to modernize the world of data. We do this in a couple different ways. The first is that we have our services arm. This is where we do our strategic planning, education, and the deployment of critical data projects. And that's at hike2.com. And then when it comes to the data and analytics community, content, and the conversation, just like what we're here to do today, you can find more about what we're up to at hike2.com/events. You can also find us listed on Eventbrite, and all of our sessions are recorded and then posted back out on YouTube. So you can certainly follow us there. A little bit of housekeeping for today's session. This is a webinar, of course, so your cameras and microphones are off, but we highly encourage collaboration and engagement via the chat, the Q&A, or in a little bit of time that we'll reserve at the end of this session if you'd like to ask some questions to Morgan and Kuldeep. And like I said, we are recording, so you can certainly find us later on YouTube as well. So some introductions for my esteemed colleagues. I have Morgan Llewellyn joining us today. He's a PhD and he is the AI practice principal. He's got over 20 years of experience and expertise in AI strategy and innovation. Here at Hike 2, Morgan leads our AI strategy. He helps the company stay at the forefront of AI technology. He has implemented a whole bunch of cutting edge AI solutions for both government agencies, Fortune 100 companies, whole bunch of legal entities, all the way here and back. So Morgan, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Kelly.
Awesome. All right. And we also have, of course, the one and only Kuldeep Singh. He is our Chief Data Officer here at Hike 2, and he's got over 20 years of experience in data and digital strategy across sectors like finance and retail and philanthropy. At Hike 2, he drives business value by using AI, automation, and data governance to improve decision-making and operational efficiencies. Kuldeep, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise, and I will pass the floor to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Kalia, for the introduction and for organizing. And I'm really excited to be here with Morgan. I think this is the first one that Morgan and I are actually together on. And looking forward to this one and many more to come on this specific topic and others, right? So we are, this topic that we're going to cover today, data and AI governance. I've been passionate about it. I've been intrigued by it for decades now, right? Especially the data governance piece. And then Morgan and I were chatting, AI governance in the past decade has continued to evolve, and it is evolving even now. And so is the data governance, right? So really passionate about this topic, very heavily interested in the research and seeing what, some of the changes across the globe are. So today we're going to, cover several facets of data and AI governance. We may not be able to cover everything in the next 40 minutes or so, but we're going to talk about the why, right? Why are we talking about it today when this has continue to exist for decades. We'll cover some of the principles. I will talk about the frameworks, and we'll also talk a little bit about the use cases and how we are seeing in the market with our clients and companies that we have worked for, adopting some of these frameworks and practices. And then finally, we're going to cover, how do you enable, not for a project or a POC, but for the entire organization, the entire, really the enterprise. So, so we'll continue to kind of talk about other things such as, what are the foundational elements, as I mentioned, the principles, the foundational elements of really achieving something that people haven't thought about, right, through with governance, which is like the strategic goals, right? Governance was always seen as in a practice of, compliance, and it still is, right? Risk management and enterprise risk, etc. But how do you kind of, achieve your strategic goal of growth and through artificial intelligence and data governance and the data governance, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So as an introduction to the topic, we live in an era where data is often termed as the new oil, right? Effectively, managing and governing this asset is really no longer optional, right? So we can now confidently say that data is, the fuel that will drive artificial intelligence, and really artificial intelligence is the catalyst that will drive, a company's growth, right? And so most organizations that are driving growth have already embraced artificial intelligence, and some of the organizations might be more on the early stages of it. But before jumping deep into the conversation, I also wanted to say that the firms that collect, store, manage, clean, and use trustworthy data to fuel their AI algorithms will have a unique perspective, right, on their markets, and they'll have the insights that nobody else has access to. But all of that, as data and AI is driving growth, the key thing that we wanted to stress upon today is that all of that has to be done responsibly, right? So responsible AI with trusted data will really drive the ultimate competitive advantage for the firms who are, in the midst of really adopting this. So today's competitive landscape demands not only just, like I said, the data and AI, but doing it responsibly. So I thought, before we get started, Morgan, what's the definition of responsible AI, right? So I'll just cover that, and then we'll get into our topics here. So for the audience, responsible AI is the practice of developing, using, and deploying artificial intelligence systems in a way that it is ethical, transparent, and accountable, right? So that is very necessary. So the frameworks that we're going to talk about today are going to be about data governance and responsible AI. And many organizations already have data governance practices, AI governance practices, but they are also at a crossroads right now because of all of the advances that we have seen with AI, right? Moving into the Gen AI in the past 3 to 4 years, and everything that's to come in the next 5 to 10 years. So this is a hot topic. It's emerging. There's a lot of information coming out of Europe and the United States, and we're going to continue to see evolution of this space, which is very exciting. So Morgan, I have a quick question. So as organizations are thinking about data and AI governance, why is this becoming, re-emerging as a hot topic right now? Why should organizations think about it?
That's a good question. So if we look at kind of traditionally or historically how organizations have leveraged, kind of data governance in general, right? It's how do you combine information to get new insights, get new value for the organization, and be able to manage the risk and the sharing of that information within or across organizations. So it's really this focus on being able to facilitate the transfer of information between, business stakeholders, et cetera. I think as we look at what's happening in generative AI and just in technology in general, the speed of development, the speed of advancement is so fast that good governance allows you to, be able to innovate quicker, faster than what you would be able to do otherwise if you didn't have a good governance policy. And so let me just kind of give an example. So suppose you have an organization that doesn't understand what data they have and how they can use it. Then when some of these, Gen AI applications come in, sometimes the easy answer is no, you can't use our data to go do this because there's not an understanding of the security risk. And what we see is organizations that do have good governance, that do understand what information is sensitive, what information is permissible to be used in, Gen AI, what are the rules around how Gen AI is going to be, leveraged within the organization, what's allowed, what's disallowed. Organizations that have that understanding and have that framework in place, they're able to move a whole lot faster. And so they're able to innovate a whole lot faster. And that separates them from the other groups. So I think that's why we're starting to see a renewed focus or a renewed energy in the governance space, is because it's not just about risk, it's about speed at this point. And an understanding that a good risk policy actually allows you to move faster. It's not about saying no quicker, it's actually about being able to say yes quicker. And so I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective, Morgan. And another thing that we are seeing is emergence of new regulation, right? I mean, I mentioned it earlier. I mean, I track Fairly AI. This is a website that tracks all sorts of regulations and governance, regulations and compliance that is being introduced, across the globe. I mean, I think last I checked, a few weeks back, it was like 155 new regulations. And I checked it last night, and 29 of them have actually passed, and they are now policy that lies with the government of certain countries, right? So how is compliance driving some of the innovation, or maybe even kind of the need for frameworks and the principles and the evolution hence?
So I think the speed at which we're seeing changes in law around the usage of data and AI, right? But really around the usage of data within AI and what AI can and can't do. I think what it's driving is really a flexibility within governance policy itself. To your point that this is an evolving and really an expanding market when it comes to governance over AI. And what organizations need is a flexible approach to governance to be able to bend and react to the changing policy that's out there. So I think that's one thing we're seeing. But one talking point I like to always kind of stress when it does come to governance in AI or even governance in data is, this is something I actually welcome in the space. I do welcome additional governance. I do welcome, kind of additional policy, because I think it takes the uncertainty away from the conversation. It takes that bullet out of the chamber. If there's a clear, list of policy or rules that AI has to play by, it makes it a whole lot easier as you position, kind of what your product does against that policy. If it's unknown what you're going to have to do, I think that's where you get into this nebulous world of, kind of, just unknown fears. And so I really welcome policy in this space. But because the policy is ever evolving, it necessitates having a flexible framework of how do you bend and adjust your governance policy within your organization to changes in the law.
Yeah, no, very well said. And towards the end of this conversation, right, one of the section actually focuses on the change management aspect that companies have to kind of adhere to or start working towards, including the enablement function, right? I mean, because like you mentioned, it's an ever evolving, ever changing ecosystem, and it's not a one and done thing that you set something up and then it's something that will be forgotten about, right? So that's great. So I want to kind of bring us into the framework talk now, right? There's when you think about data governance, audience might be familiar with DAMA principles, right? There's DCAM now, and then there's a Data Governance Institute has its own framework, and then you move away into the artificial intelligence realm. There is, NIST has a framework. There is Artificial Intelligence Governance Institute in Europe that's responding to the EU AI Act, and there's Responsible AI. There are all these organizations that are kind of really publishing their frameworks. Frameworks being frameworks, one thing that I've noticed, Morgan, is that when you actually take one of these frameworks and take it into an organization to implement it, right, that's where the experience comes in. And with our experience over the last couple of decades, right, really implementing and also dealing with the failures and the successes of the program. One thing, I mean, this is not a sales conversation, but I would just bring up that Hike2 has a data and AI governance framework that is, culmination of all of these different principles that already exist with the organizations that I just spoke about. But we have kind of just infused our experience onto it. And moving a little bit deeper, and then Morgan, I have a quick question for you on this. When we start thinking about frameworks, organizations that are actually considering either whether they already have a data governance framework or an AI framework that isn't, it's either working or it's in early stages. And if you're struggling with implementing something, what I would do as a practitioner, right? I would step back and think about, hey, what are some of the core principles that I'm trying to kind of, facilitate or govern, right? I mean, so those principles need to be kind of, identified. And when I think about a good framework and what are some of the principles that define that framework, I kind of think about it in 3 to 4 different buckets, right? Starting with the human aspects, right, which is the people, roles, the ownership, and stewardship, followed by more of a defensive approach, which is, who has access to data, this information security, the compliance and the regulations, and then pivoting onto more of a trust relationship with your data, which is where we're talking about data quality, the lineage, and the provenance, and then eventually heading into, the infrastructure, the scalability, more on the automation side that artificial intelligence is affording us. But artificial intelligence, if you think about a principle, that really a lot of people talk about now, and it's very well written about, and you can go to conferences just on that specific topic, is the ethics and bias, right? Which really define the responsible AI. And so the principles of ethics and bias are critical, which is kind of stretching that definition of governance that some of us in the room might be familiar with. So data governance, it stretched us towards privacy, and it stretched us towards more on the information security, data classification. And AI is really stretching us towards the right into the realm of ethics and bias and responsible AI, explainability, right? More responsibility around your decision making, so it doesn't become a black box. So that brings me to a question, Morgan, that I think you can help me with, is around Gen AI, because Gen AI is now really stretching even more so, right? AI has been around for the last 10, 20 years. I mean, people say it was there 50 years back. However, with Gen AI, at least the ones that we are touching as consumers, as practitioners, how is it really stretching these principles?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, to answer that, let me relate to kind of organizations and how we typically think about data governance. So in a complex organization, so you've got a couple different kind of governance models here, right? You've got a federated model and you have a centralized model. Most complex organizations are going to be more federated, right? Or that kind of hybrid approach between a federated and a centralized organization. So you've got this, let's just suppose it's a federated though. So you've got this federated organization where different departments own a technology, right? They own the CRM, or they own the they own the SAPs, or whatever that technology might be. So different pieces of the organization are having data come in, and those are essentially the data stewards. And so those data stewards are saying, okay, here's what information we're going to share with the broader organization. Maybe we're going to do some tagging of what's sensitive, what can be shared. Here are the rules around being shared. And then on the other side of governance, you have the requesters. Okay, well, Kuldeep has an interesting piece of information that if I combine it with, say, my HR information, then I'm going to have some new insight. And so that's typically how we've thought about kind of this governance model. You've got people who are the data stewards, who more or less kind of quote unquote own the data, and then you've got these requesters. And how do we put in place a framework to allow the sharing of information between these organizations? Well, now what Gen AI does is it still needs all that, right? I still need to request data from your organization to put into Gen AI to get some new insight. But what's really kind of changed and what's a little bit different is now I'm creating a lot more data than maybe what I traditionally did in just like an ML model. Maybe an ML model produced some scores. And if we're being honest, in and of themselves, the scores aren't that interesting as like new data types other than how you're implementing them in your business, right? Making decisions off of them, et cetera. But no one's going to go and, or very rarely do you go and leverage those scores in different places within the organization. But with Gen AI, now the requester is taking information from Kuldeep, and I'm going to go and generate a lot more information. And who's the owner of that new information? That's a bit of a nuance with Gen AI. And just like we have to have an owner over, the source of truth created by your CRM, we now need kind of an owner over what's being generated by what's being created by the Gen AI, who's the owner of that information, and how do you even share or make that shareable across the organization as well, just like we did. So we're really, it's almost like ETL 2.0, where we're creating this whole new cycle of data that has to be managed, whereas previously we didn't. So that's what we're seeing with Gen AI. Okay. It's really just adding a layer of complexity at kind of the end of what we thought was traditionally the process. We have this whole new process being created.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you bring up a really interesting, concept, right? The owner, who's the owner of, as part of the artifacts that are coming out of, the outputs that are coming out of the Gen AI. Who is the owner? I mean, is it like we've had chief data officers, we have chief, data and analytic officers. Now we are seeing AI officers. Is it going to be the chief privacy officer? Or because I'm not talking about a use case here, right? I'm talking about the enterprise, a big JP Morgan. I mean, how are big organizations thinking about it in your experience?
Well, yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think in smaller organizations, having it centralized makes sense, right? Because it's manageable. But in these larger organizations where you do have ownership in kind of different departments or different silos, ownership of technology, then I think that gets a little bit harder where you've got a single owner. But I mean, I think there's a little bit nuance, and I think the world's still figuring this out is, there's a little bit of a source of truth problem here too. So if I'm taking information from you from say the CRM and I'm passing it through Gen AI and some additional information is being added to that, right? But it also contains some of your information. How do we untangle the two? And do you own a piece of that output, or do I own the output because I created it? I think there's some nuance there, and it's a little bit unknown. I think really this comes back to having a policy is the best approach, right? And having a policy to be able to facilitate this, whether the answer is Morgan owns it because Morgan created it, whether it's a different answer around, well, actually we have this part of the organization owns the Gen AI, LLM APIs, and so they're the owners. I think that's a little bit difficult, but that could be an answer as well. But having a policy over who's the owner, that's the most important part, right? And over what can be put into the model, right? Just like we had the conversation around in, traditional AI, what can you put into a machine learning model? What can't you? You have to have that same policy of what can you put into the Gen AI model, and then the output, just having who is the owner of the output. Is it the person who basically requests it for their business purpose? Is it someone else in the organization? As long as you have those things figured out, I think you're at least going in the right direction.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is a great call out, right? I mean, that accountability, because when we start thinking about, I mean, I didn't mention this explicitly when I spoke about the principles, there's the whole concept of, being transparent, right? Making sure that there is integrity, right? Making sure that whatever is coming out on the other end, right, which is explainable. But if you don't have that accountability, or if you don't have that person who's owning that decision, then really, you can talk about transparency forever. When things go wrong, who's answerable, right? I mean, some of those things have to be thought about. So as we kind of, wrap this principle section, I want to jump into the framework, because principles define your framework. But people have to think about, right, that accountability, being transparent, being able to explain. So that's critical. One last thing, right? I was at a conference, Morgan, just a few weeks back, and I was talking to this a practitioner from a large investment bank, and they were talking to me about, hey, we want to interact with these LLMs that are available, right? Which have been available through tech companies. They build these powerful models. Now I am interacting with them. I feel that, how do I really control, or how do I get good governance? How do I trust? Because I'm sharing my information with a model that was built with generic data. Right now, I have all of this information that is very proprietary to me. So how do I actually build a governance on things that I don't really control, which are these LLMs that are, Microsoft, Google, any of the ones that are out there, right, including Meta. Are there any thoughts around that? And then we'll move into the framework.
Yeah, I think there's two different ways you can approach that question. The first is, how do you think about governance in terms of model integrity and model accuracy? How do you govern, kind of the cult of the LLM? I think that's one approach. The second one is from a security aspect around, what information do you provide to the model? How do you ensure that your information is not being retained if that's a requirement? And also, I think there's a lot of sensitivity around, fine tuning of LLMs as well. If you're creating an LLM, is that appropriate? Can that be done? So I think there's a few different ways to slice and dice that question. What I would say is, in general, and I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but in general, when it comes to LLMs, it is different from our traditional kind of machine learning, kind of statistical modeling approach, because we do, basically the model's trained, right? And we haven't validated the use case that we're actually intending to use it for. And so putting in place a good architecture that limits how that LLM is being called specific to the use case that it's intended to be used for, I think is really important. So basically putting guardrails around the model so that you're not going and, running into issues of, creating nonsensical answers, which, if you log into LinkedIn, last year, you would have seen lots of those fun examples. So well-architected kind of calls to the LLM that in some ways mimic, kind of the testing process done in traditional ML. That's one. And then just awareness around what data, what is your use case? What data can you put into the ML? It's always a good policy to think about zero data retention, not using your data for additional model training. And then depending on your organization, I do see a lot of interest out there in fine-tuning LLMs. Before you do that, I just, pause and think about, is this information, can I use information from one client across, all my clients? Think about, how is that information being used, and how would the output of those fine-tuned models be used? In some cases, it might be okay. In other cases, I'd steer clear of it.
Yeah, thank you for that. You have a lot to think about, a lot to ponder, a lot to unpack for organizations that are implementing. But good news is that, there are well-defined theories out there, and it has to be, specific to your organization and your organization's need. So thinking about your organization's need, right, that brings me to the conversation of the framework itself. I think when we think about, as we were building the framework that we are sharing with some of our clients, we think about, let's simplify the framework, right? Let's not put too much jargon into it. And when you think about a simple framework, it brings you back to the same questions that you've been asking anyway, right? As you're creating your business case, why are we doing it? What are we doing? How are we doing it? And where should we do it? Right? So the why question is all about your strategic alignment and vision, which was missing, especially in the data governance realm, and because it was seen as an enforcing function, very related to the, it's very critical, right? I don't want to come out as I'm beating down on regulations and compliance, but that's where governance grew. And it did well for many companies, many industries actually, right? However, there's questions about, all of the investment that we're putting into governance. How does it really align with our strategy and our vision? And how are we going to measure some of the things, that lead up to the return on investment, right? Whether it's performance, whether it's productivity, whether it's risk management, KPIs that you might already have, or meeting compliance. The next part, which is the what, that's where you actually are doing things, right? Whether it's, all of the principles I spoke about, ownership, lineage, quality, access, controls, privacy, security, just to create reliable and organized data ecosystems. And then as you kind of move into the next phase, which is, how are you going to do it? Generally speaking, and we'll talk about change management as I mentioned earlier, but this stage really centers around the how stage centers around change management and adoption, right? Fostering a data-centric culture through targeted training, policy development, bringing in automation, bringing in the right tools and technology, making sure that the operating model is very well understood. And then from there, you move to the where. Where are you going to apply all of that, right? So you described your why, you described your, what are you going to do? And how are you going to enable the entire organization? But where do you do it? And that's where organizations need to really focus on their information management or information governance, right? Where data is being created, where information is being used, who's touching the data and how it flows through the organization itself, even before it hits your data ops, ML ops, AI ops, and eventually some kind of insight that comes out on the other side of it, which then flows back into your organization. So that needs to be well understood, your information management practices, including the repositories, underlying repositories like the application repositories, your cloud data stores, right? Your EDWs, your data lakes, your data lake houses, all of that. And then, the next bit, which I want to talk about is, so all of what I've spoken about thus far, for people in the room who have been dealing with data governance, they'll very clearly recognize with, the four, the why, what, how, and where. But as Morgan mentioned, as we're moving into more of the AI realm, and especially in the Gen AI realm, we start talking about responsible AI. And I think, Morgan, you alluded to some of the foundational pillars, but that need to be thought about. But if you can again articulate what are some of the foundational pillars that organizations need to think about as they are thinking about using their data governance and extending it to bringing in more AI governance and calling it data and AI governance versus data governance and AI governance?
Yeah, I think, with AI, one of the things that we're always worried about is bias, right? And so when AI is being used to help with decisions, understanding if these models are biased is really important. So I think that's one thing to consider. That said, I think the right place to start is, generative AI or AI. It's really no different where you start than where you would with just data governance, right? Being able to understand what data you have, what sensitive data you have, and who can use and who can see that information, and how can that information be used in decisions. I think whether that's, through dashboards or through ML, that process looks a lot, very similar. I think where AI starts to differentiate a little bit from, kind of traditional data governance is around the automation and the, what I would say the ability to, at some level have verifiable bias in the output, and consistently verifiable bias. So that's one of the things that if you're looking at, implementing, governance around AI, the thing I would stress is piggyback on what you're already doing on data governance. And if you're doing nothing on data governance, think about who owns the data, what can be shared, and how do you make a request to that organization. If you already have that in place, then really what you need to do is start thinking about bias. And what is bias in terms of, race, gender, age, those types of things, location in some places, as well as the other thing to think about is consistency of the output. So not just a one-time bias, but ensuring that your results are consistent over time. That's another type of bias that with Gen AI and some of the creativity you really have to think about. So those are two things that I'd really think about. When it comes to biases, make sure it's consistent and make sure you're not hitting any of those kind of third rails. The other thing I would, again, consider is whatever the policy is on, being able to delete information or being able to retain information, that should be implemented on whatever's being generated by the Gen AI too. So that's got to follow through, just like the information that you're collecting about an individual upfront and say your CRM, any information you're generating about that person through Gen AI should be under the same policy.
Well, thank you for that. One thing as I'm listening, Morgan, I think some of the core principles, that were always there, continue to exist, right? They're not going away. A question that I've been asked multiple times, right? I would be interested in hearing your perspective as when you, especially in the highly regulated industries, right? When we go into financial services, healthcare, I mean, you work very heavily with legal tech, uh, highly regulated, highly, compliant, and they have to, adhere to all of these compliance. So they already have their risk frameworks, right? They already have, some organizations may not, but, generally speaking, if you're an SEC facing or, you're reporting up to some compliance body, you have your enterprise risk function, you have your the KPIs that you monitor the health of your organization with, right? And now you're kind of pulling in all of this information through Gen AI and all of the advancements that are happening. Are you thinking that you need to continue to leverage what is existing, and as a result of all of the advancements, you're making small adjustments to the frameworks and the policies and the governance vehicles that are already available?
That's what I would encourage people to do. Yes, 100%. It's not a throw everything out. It's how do you iterate and improve, and then how do you isolate the risk of Gen AI, and how do you mitigate that risk? I think that's really what organizations are trying to understand today. And I think if we take a slightly positive approach, a number of those risks can be mitigated through just good data governance, or what we would historically have called good data governance, right? Access, requesting, sharing of information, good metadata tagging, et cetera. Where the additional risk comes out is, just making sure that you have security on your endpoints, as well as who owns the output coming from that information and how is it tied to your data policy.
Yep. No, that's great. And the last question on this segment, which is around the principles and the frameworks, one thing that I'm hearing, especially coming out of SaaS organizations, right, or tech organizations, really is as companies are thinking about implementing AI governance framework, they don't have to start things from scratch, right? There is governance as a service, like there's a Shapley additive explanations, right? There's LIME, which is a local interpretable model agnostic. I mean, all of those concepts already exist and they've continued to exist, right? The explainability of your model becomes important because at the end of the day, right, the decisions that you're making in organizations, right, have to be explained. Somebody has to explain them to, so that is a very scientific need. It's not like optional. It's not that something that you're going to wing. So as organizations are starting to put these frameworks in, are you thinking that there's an industry that our attendees can kind of lean into, where governance as a service might become an offering that they can just use and implement for their specific needs? Are you thinking that the industry is heading in that direction?
I think that's a good question. So here's a thought here's a thought that's always rattling around in the back of my head. Is, I worked in big tech for a while. Big tech is a little bit different than a financial organization, than a healthcare organization, than a government, than a law firm, right? In the sense that the people who own the data, it's not as varied, right? You've got at some level your product or your engineering team. They are an IT company where the collection of data is part of the product, right? And so it's a little bit more centralized. And so the way that they can facilitate information sharing, given that they are, teams of software engineers who think only about automation, they're just better equipped from the way that they're structured, from the way that the data comes into the organization, as well as the skills of the people. They're better equipped to be able to have, tech forward solutions. If you pivot to a healthcare, a financial services, a law firm, they're, while they're capable of being able to take advantage of some of these tools, there is a natural human element that, just exists within these organizations. They are at some level a little bit more complex. They're a little bit more relationship based. They are a little bit less, for lack of a better term, technical savvy. And so there is a different, I think when I think about successful organizations that are more complex like this, there tends to be a little bit more of a human element to it. And so I think that's something important to call out is, yes, I think coming out of tech, you see some really great, there's a lot of really great tools out there. However, I think when you try and map those tools onto these more complex organizations, you do need to have some sort of customization. You do need to have some sort of fine tuning. And, maybe that's kind of where your question's going is, I think that's where there is a little bit of an opportunity for some sort of service-based approach around how do you take a tool, a tech forward tool, map it to an organization and customize it for that organization and for those people.
Yeah, no, I mean, very well said. And, just a quick example, I used to work for a wealth management firm, right? That was starting to kind of, really bring in the Gen AI. I mean, what they really wanted to do is they wanted to have a much more robust relationship between the client and the financial advisor, right? And there were a lot of questions being asked of the financial advisor, and the firm was able to capture some of these questions and these interactions and curate what the firm actually believed in. And these 25,000 curated interactions, was constantly evolving because the interaction between client and financial advisors were happening. There were about 15,000 advisors, right? And millions of clients, actually. So, somebody was actually curating these interactions and making sure that that was relevant, which then was fed into the LLMs, to produce some automation and automated responses, right? But the human in the loop actually is becoming a thing. A human in the loop, HITL, I think it's what it's called. And how do you make lives of humans easier as they are asked to govern more and things like that. Great. No, I mean, I think this is where I would pause for a second. I have a couple of more things that I want to cover, Kalia, but I was wondering, if there are any questions that we can cover from the audience, because I don't want to miss out on that opportunity.
Any questions coming in right now, except for one question about, kind of logistics around if there'll be any slides to review after. But if anybody does have any questions, this is certainly the time to go ahead and ask them, and I'll just keep an eye on that chat, Kuldeep, as you kind of continue on.
Yep, and my response to that, will be share slides. Yes, we have very specific slides for our frameworks and the principles that we believe in. And we're happy to kind of, share some of that information, but also if you are interested in going at any level of depth, because we are just touching the surface here, by the way, right? And so happy to kind of, engage after this conversation as well. So thank you for that, Kelly. Morgan, I wanted to kind of, I took us in that direction of, the financial advisor, a wealth management firm, and how they were kind of curating their prompts and their questions, and how there's a separate department, that's kind of looking at the interactions and making sure that, they're safely curated and there's no harm that's caused to the client, because at the end of the day, these financial advisors have to answer to the clients based upon the decisions that they're making. Are there other such examples that you've come across, where clients have been concerned about, hey, we want to use LLM, we see the benefit of it, we are heading in that direction, but then, we worry about all of that, right? I mean, are there any specific examples that could kind of, better describe the fear, maybe?
Yeah, I think, when I think about LLMs and generative AI and how folks use it, I think all too often we focus on the generative part, right? Of how do we use an LLM to almost be that last mile, right? I want to generate something that I'm going to go put in front of a customer. I'm going to generate something that, needs to be legally defensible. And, when we're dealing with those use cases, 100% we see folks, a little bit apprehensive, as they should be. If that's not well tested, well validated, well vetted. What I encourage folks to do is when they're thinking about generative AI, focus on the initial risk mitigating use cases. Don't focus on the most risky use cases where you're asking it to do that, ultimate customer interaction, unless it's like something more or less harmless, right? Like an email response to, hey, we'll follow up here shortly, etc. But you can use LLMs because LLMs are so great at understanding context, because they're great at understanding content. Think about how you leverage an LLM earlier in your data stack to produce better quality data, better insights for your organization. I think those are risk mitigating approaches when you kind of shift left and you get deeper into your data stack and you use it to really address data quality, data extraction issues that you've historically dealt with. So do we run across folks who, want to use LLMs, for, what could be, risk enhancing kind of use cases? Sure. What we tend to do is focus on risk mitigating use cases initially. And there's just a number of them out there.
Yep. No, I mean, that is well said. And the point I wanted to make here was, through the examples and, what you provided, Morgan, was, if you remember about 10 years back, right? I mean, we were not in the Gen AI, or at least we were not talking about it openly like we do now, right? In the last 3 years. Target came out and said, hey, they know which couple is pregnant, right? They know which individual or which customer is actually going through pregnancy based upon their spending habits, right? It's just as simple of an example of responsible AI, right? And high risk, I think you mentioned, right? While I don't think the Target innovation team was thinking about, the adverse impact of that, right? They were thinking that, hey, we know, and now we can better serve you. So the intent was, we can better serve you with the products that you need during this very important phase of your life. But did they actually ask, that group of the segment or those people or those individuals or those customers, right? Whether they wanted to be identified and they wanted to be known by the organization. So I think that as simple of an example that is, and you can now take that as a core principle and you can start working backwards towards your frameworks. And like you said, right, what do you want to work on first? How are you going to kind of, get better at it? And what are some of the risky? Eventually, I think the point is, what's the value of your organization, right? So that is the core principle behind these frameworks is, what are your values? What is your brand? Because these use cases and these products and services are what people are going to touch. And there is going to be kind of, a level of sophistication that is needed to be able to explain why certain decisions were made.
Yeah, let me give you a nice little example of how you can use AI or, kind of machine learning, generative AI to actually reduce risk and enhance your governance. So a lot of organizations, again, very complex organizations, they have a duty to notify if there's a data breach, right? However, who do you notify in the event of a data breach is a very complicated question, because that information is, spans a number of unstructured documents, a number of databases, et cetera. And so how do you use, AI to be able to understand who are those key contacts within an organization, so that in the event of a data breach, or in the event that you just need to delete data because, that data is expired, per, either a legal requirement or your own firm's SLAs, you're going to remove data, being able to notify a client that, you're going to do something with your data. That's an application of AI that we've done of how do you identify who are those key contacts, so that in the event of something, you know who to contact. That's a very simple kind of risk mitigating, but also aligns with your existing data governance policy, right? So how do we use these new tools to provide a better policy?
Yep. Thank you for that. So I'm going to move us forward. I know we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and then we'll pause for questions again. So in summary, what we covered today is, why is this topic relevant, right? Why is there so much interest now? I mean, interest has been there. I mean, for the past 10 years, 20 years, but it's elevated now. So we spoke a little bit about that. We gave a few examples of how our attendees can kind of think about, as they're thinking about these frameworks. We spoke about some core principles. We moved into the frameworks. We tied it to kind of the value of your organization, and really engaging the whole organization, right? I mean, it's not like the data group or the AI group or the Gen AI group, it's just like the risk organization. So as you're thinking for an enterprise, it needs to be thought top down and bottom up, right? I mean, so that's where your board, your executives, your practitioners, and your engineers, and your data center or your cloud operations, right? Everybody's involved in creating this framework. It's not you can do it centrally, and then you're not providing perspective as to how these frameworks need to be implemented. But that brings me to my next point, which is how do you enable an organization, right? So when we think about aligning governance with business transformation, a key part is seeing governance not as just another compliance task, but as we've been talking about, but as a strategic enabler. If you frame it in terms of, Morgan, of real business goals, right? Growth, improving customer service, and running operations smoothly, it becomes clear that governance directly supports our bigger picture. And one thing that I have noticed, because I've been doing data governance at least since 1998, is that governance has a branding issue, right? I mean, people think of it as, that's something that they have to adhere to, an enforcer, right? Whereas I think the message is changing to no, it is an enforcer, and it is very critical for the viability of your organization. However, good governance of data, responsible governance of your AI, as I had mentioned earlier, will drive your ultimate competitive advantage, especially in the next 5-10 years, right? So what are some of the things that organizations need to think about? A couple of things that come to mind, Morgan, are change management, right? The enabling of the whole organization, the education and the fluency and the literacy around all of that. What have you seen, in the clients you work with? How are they thinking about all of that?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things, right? So when thinking about messaging, I like to focus on sharing of data. It's, good governance allows you to share necessary information across groups, and allows you to have access to an understanding of what data can be shared and how that shared data can be used. So I think that's one thing. So focusing on the sharing aspect, I think, is a really important piece. The second thing is, good getting started in governance, right? If you are getting started, whether you're getting started net new or whether you're getting started with Gen AI, I think getting started with data governance, there's a lot of similarities to how you get started with, a lake house or a traditional data warehouse, et cetera, where it is one of these things where start small, identify where the value is. So coming back to governance, right? Where is the value? There's probably a couple of risk mitigating things you have to deal with, such as, who to inform or, deleting information that's being retained or customers who have left, right? So there's pieces like that. But then there's also a few use cases around if we just share this information with this organization or this information with this department, here's an opportunity for us to get better as an organization. And so rather than trying to govern everything all at once, how do you identify, here are the pockets, here are the sources, here are the systems where we want to start putting some governance around it. And even here are some of the fields that we're most interested in sharing. Because if we can share that information and combine it, with another source or another system, we can generate some value. So starting small, it's the quintessential approach to anything in IT. Start small, identify where the value is, and then build on top of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, very well said. I think when I think about the, and I just recently spoke about it, the foundation of good responsible AI, right, is really, it starts with just the foundation models and the governance around it, right? And then data is a big deal. And how do you govern, so the whole governance piece that we just spoke about. But the last bit is, maybe there's a human component. No, not maybe, there is a human component, which you brought up, Morgan. And then the last bit is the use case itself, right? I mean, you have to drive this forward because AI has to deliver value. Value can be your back office, or it could be, the products and services you're delivering to the market. And if you're thinking about implementing AI, some use cases are very large, right? Like, the example that I was talking about, 15,000 FAs, millions of clients, and trillions of asset under management. However, organizations should think about, what are those use cases? What are those transformational capabilities that they're building? And then now start aligning these, principles and frameworks around that. But also, I think, because governance has had a branding, issue, I think starting to think about a center of enablement, right? Executive support, education literacy, right? Engaging with key stakeholders, feedback loops, and making sure that, your external stakeholders, like your regulators and your customers and and your internal stakeholders, people in the back office, your executives, right? It's a cross-functional group of people who are really helping you shape and evolve these frameworks over a period of time, right? So that center of enablement is a huge thing. And one last thing, Morgan, I'll say is about the change management. I think you speak about that, which is this isn't a one and done thing, right? I mean, governance has to be part of your change management. Things are evolving too fast for it to kind of, just be off the ledge, and then we miss out on things. I mean, the cost of missing out things is too big, especially as we move into, Gen AI and quantum and a whole bunch of other things that are coming our way, right? I mean, it could be a matter of, survivability, your competitive positioning. So the stakes are pretty high, but, let's kind of boil it down to use cases, one thing at a time, add value, and then continue to move forward. Any parting statements, Morgan? I know we have to wrap in 2 minutes, so I'm just hurrying through this section.
Yeah, no, nothing on my side. I mean, we've got a couple minutes. Maybe we can open it up for if there are any questions or, anything we want to wrap up with.
I don't see any specific questions coming through, but I want to thank you both for this great discussion. There's a lot to unpack there, and it was awesome getting a peek inside each of your brains for how this applies to your respective worlds. So of course, as always, thank you to our attendees for joining. If you'd like to see a recording of this video, you can check us out at our YouTube channel. And we've also dropped some links into the chat for where you can find our other events. We wish everybody a wonderful day. Again, Kuldeep, thank you for leading us through. Morgan, thank you for sharing your expertise.
All right, thank you, Kelly. Really appreciate it. Enjoyed it, Morgan. You should do this.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep.
Thank you, Kuldeep. Thank you, Kelly. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.